A king's power was written on parchment long before it was etched in stone. Our vision of medieval rulers often comes from chronicles of glorious battles and sweeping laws, but those are just the headlines. The true story of how kingdoms were actually run is hidden in palace archives. These are not libraries of philosophy or prayer, but warehouses of administration. They hold the memos, the receipts, and the frantic reports written by royal clerks. By exploring these documents, you will gain a backstage pass to the gritty reality of the medieval state, seeing how governments truly functioned behind the curtain of ceremony. How did a king collect taxes from a rebellious baron? What orders were sent when plague or famine struck? The answers are not in the grand proclamations, but in the ink-stained paperwork of daily crisis and control. What do you think it really took to hold a kingdom together? To find those answers, we must first step inside the room where they were written. A palace archive was not a single grand library. It was a collection of working documents, the administrative memory of a kingdom. Think of it as the hard drive of the medieval state. While monasteries preserved beautiful religious texts and scholars copied ancient philosophy, royal clerks were busy producing something far more mundane and far more revealing. They filled receipts, drafted letters to local sheriffs, recorded payments for everything from castle repairs to a king's new pair of boots, and kept notes on legal disputes that reached the royal court. These were not meant for public glory or posterity. They were the day-to-day paperwork of power, the endless stream of decisions and transactions required to keep a complex realm from falling apart. Their survival is one of history's great accidents. Many were lost to fire, damp, or simple neglect. Others were cut up and reused, their sturdy parchment becoming the binding for later books. The fragments that remain, discovered in forgotten castle cellars or peeled from inside ancient book covers, are our most direct connection to the operational reality of medieval rule. Each scrap of parchment is a tiny, unedited window into how a government actually functioned when the crown was off and the work began. The most perfect example of this administrative reality is the English Exchequer. Picture a great hall where royal power was measured not in swords but in silver pennies. Twice a year, the king's financial officers would gather for an audit, a ritual of accountability that transformed abstract authority into hard numbers. The room itself was named for the checkered cloth that covered the table, a giant accounting board used for calculating sums with counters. This was the stage for a high-stakes performance where the sheriffs, the king's chief officers in each county, had to answer for every tax and fine they had collected. The atmosphere was one of intense scrutiny, a place where the wealth of the realm was literally laid out on the table. The process created a remarkable artifact, the pipe rolls. These were the annual financial records of the kingdom, meticulously written on long, sewn together strips of parchment that were then rolled up for storage. They began in the mid-12th century under King Henry II, and they offer us a running financial commentary on medieval England. But to call them simple balance sheets would be a profound mistake. While they record revenue from taxes and royal lands, they spill over with human drama. You find entries for debts owed to the crown, some forgiven, others pursued for years. You see records of fines imposed for everything from trespassing on royal forests to settling a violent dispute. A sheriff might account for the income from a town's market, and on the very same line, note the cost of repairing a bridge washed out by floods. Perhaps most fascinating are the glimpses into the personal finances of the king's subjects, high and low. The rolls reveal when a wealthy baron paid a large sum for the king's goodwill, or when a local knight incurred a debt for a license to marry. They show the crown functioning as a kind of central bank and court of appeals. its reach extending into the everyday economic lives of thousands of people. Each entry is a frozen moment of negotiation, obligation, or conflict. By reading these rolls, you are not just studying medieval economics. You are listening to the quiet, persistent hum of government at work, the sound of a kingdom building itself one recorded transaction at a time. The pipe rolls reveal a kingdom's finances, but to understand the king's own power, you must look inside his home. The very heart of early medieval government was not a ministry or a parliament, but the royal household itself, known in Latin as the Domus Regus. This was not just a family residence, it was a traveling court, a military headquarters, and the central administrative bureau of the realm, all rolled into one. Governance flowed directly from the personal management of the king's estate. To see this system in action, we turn to a different kind of record from the palace archives, the household rolls and wardrobe accounts. These documents are breathtakingly mundane, and that is precisely what makes them so revolutionary. They show us that running a kingdom and running a large, mobile domestic establishment were essentially the same task. One remarkable set of records, the wardrobe accounts of King Edward I of England, reads like the shopping list for a gigantic, perpetually moving operation. There are entries for thousands of pounds of wax, purchased not for candles, but to make the official seals that authenticated every royal command. The same document that notes the price of oats for the king's horses on a Tuesday might, on the very next line, record the wages for a knight sent on a secret diplomatic mission to France. You see payments for spices for the royal table sitting alongside funds allocated to hire engineers for a siege. The royal baker, the chancellor who kept the Great Seal, the messenger riding to a distant castle, and the archer preparing for campaign, they were all paid from the same household treasury. This blending of domestic and state finance is the key to understanding early government. There was no separation between the king's private purse and the public treasury. A war was funded by the same mechanism that fed the court. A treaty was negotiated by servants who also managed the king's travel arrangements. This system meant that the most trusted officers of the state were, first and foremost, the king's personal servants. The man who kept the accounts for the wardrobe, for instance, held one of the most powerful financial positions in the kingdom because he controlled access to the ready cash the king needed for everything from gifts to allies to emergency military supplies. His ledgers did not distinguish between a state expense and a household one. They simply recorded what the king needed to sustain his person and his authority. This intimate household model of power made government incredibly flexible and personally loyal, but it also made the realm deeply vulnerable to the character and capabilities of the king himself. The efficiency of the entire state depended on the management skills of his domestic staff. So when we examine an entry for 5 barrels of wine or a new saddle, we are not looking at trivial domestic details. We are reading the raw data of sovereignty, seeing how the muscle of royal power was built from the daily grind of logistics, loyalty, and ledger keeping. This household system faced its ultimate test when disaster struck. The true measure of any government is not how it manages a quiet season, but how it responds to a crisis. Palace archives hold the frantic, unvarnished evidence of this struggle, transforming from orderly ledgers into bulletins from the edge of chaos. We can see the machinery of the state shifting into an emergency mode, often with brutal efficiency. Consider the practice of purveyance. This was the king's right to forcibly purchase supplies for his armies at a price he set. In the archives, this appears as a flood of writs and commissions sent to local officials. One document might authorize royal agents to seize every cart and horse in a county to transport grain. Another commands a town to deliver hundreds of salted fish or barrels of ale to a muster point. On parchment, it looks like tidy logistics. On the ground, it was a deeply resented burden that could strip a community bare. a stark demonstration that the king's immediate need for war overrode all local rights and economies. Similarly, commissions of array, the orders to local knights to raise and equip fighting men from their districts, reveal the government reaching directly into every shire to pull the kingdom's human resources toward the front line. These were not polite requests, they were directives backed by the threat of severe penalty, and the repeated reissuing of these commissions, often with more desperate language, hints at the difficulty of enforcement when local loyalties were strained. But the archives reveal a different, more haunting kind of strain during catastrophes beyond human control. The Great Famine of the early 14th century, caused by years of disastrous weather and failed harvests, left its mark not in musters for war, but in a paralysis of normal administration. Tax revenues plummeted because people had nothing left to give. Records show royal orders attempting to fix the price of grain to prevent profiteering, a well-intentioned but often unenforceable response to market collapse. The paper trail grows thinner, as if the government itself was reeling, its usual mechanisms of control rendered useless by a force it could not command. Then came an even greater crisis. The arrival of the Black Death in the mid-14th century presents perhaps the most stark contrast between the theory of royal power and its practical limits. Early royal proclamations tried to assert control in traditional ways. One infamous English ordinance attempted to freeze wages, blaming laborers for demanding higher pay after so many had been lost, a futile effort to legislate against the laws of supply and despair. But the most telling documents are the ones that stop. In many regions, the meticulous flow of court rolls, tax assessments, and property transfers simply halts. The scribes themselves were gone. In places where records resume, they do so with a new, shaky hand, listing vast tracts of land as empty or in the Lord's hand because no heir could be found. The archive, in its sudden silence and its stunned new entries, captures the moment the old order fractured. It shows a government built for managing estates and raising armies utterly overwhelmed by a biological catastrophe. The response was not coordinated policy, but localized survival and painful, improvised adaptation. These crisis documents do more than recount events. They let us hear the creaking of the administrative machine under impossible stress, and in doing so, they reveal the brittle boundaries of medieval power. Crisis exposed the limits of royal power, but in ordinary times, the king's greatest tool for governing was not his army, but his court of law. For the average person, the most tangible interaction with the crown was not a tax collector or a herald, but a legal writ. Justice was a core service of the medieval state, and remarkably, it was also a major source of its income. The palace archives preserve this system in stunning detail, transforming abstract concepts of law into thousands of individual human conflicts, each one a story of grievance and hoped for resolution. To understand this, you must understand the writ. This was not a long, philosophical decree. It was a standardized, formulaic order from the king, written on a small strip of parchment that set a legal process in motion. If someone stole your property or broke a contract or unlawfully occupied your land, you could purchase a writ from the royal chancery. That purchase price, recorded meticulously, was your first payment for royal justice. The writ itself commanded a local sheriff to summon the accused to court or to investigate the facts of the case. These writs were so numerous they were copied onto long, continuous rolls of parchment known as Chancery rolls, creating an endless catalogue of official royal commands streaming out from the center of power to every corner of the realm. But the writ was only the beginning. The real drama is found in the next set of documents, the plea rolls. These are the verbatim records of what actually happened in the royal courts. Here, the dry machinery of government springs to life with startling immediacy. The Latin text, written in a hurried, cursive hand by court clerks, captures arguments, excuses, delays, and verdicts. You read about a widow suing her neighbor for cutting down her apple trees, a merchant accusing a partner of absconding with the profits from a wool shipment, or villagers presenting evidence that their lord had blocked a common path they had used for generations. Each entry is a frozen moment of social tension, brought before the king's justices in the hope of a definitive solution. These records reveal not just the law, but how it was applied, twisted, or ignored. You see patterns of corruption, like sheriffs taking bribes to delay serving a writ, or local juries being intimidated by a powerful landlord. You find cases where a plaintiff, frustrated with a corrupt local court, pays for a royal writ to remove the case to the king's own justices, a direct appeal to central authority against local injustice. This was a powerful check on the ambitions of regional nobles, offering ordinary people a pathway above the heads of their immediate lords. Yet the plea rolls also show the system's fragility. Many cases simply disappear from the record after several adjournments, suggesting an out-of-court settlement, exhaustion of funds, or the intimidating influence of the stronger party. The constant flow of these cases demonstrates that royal justice was a service in high demand, a product people were willing to pay for. It generated a steady revenue stream from writ fees and court fines, making the law not just an instrument of order, but a pillar of royal finance. When you read a plea roll, you are not just studying legal history. You are sitting in a crowded courtroom 7 centuries ago, listening to the voices of people leveraging the only system they had to resolve a dispute, seek restitution, or simply be heard. The archive, in its relentless detail, proves that government functioned most effectively not when it projected sheer force, but when it sold the promise of a fair hearing. Royal justice relied on a constant flow of information, and gathering that intelligence was the medieval state's most delicate task. A king ruling from a palace or a mobile court could not govern by decree alone. He had to see what was happening in distant ports, in restless borderlands, and in the hearts of his own nobles. To do this, he built an early information network, one whose traces are preserved in the quietest letters and most systematic surveys of the archives. The most famous of these data collection projects is England's Domesday Book, compiled in 1086. On the surface, it is a vast, dry catalogue of who owned what land, how many ploughs they had, and how many villagers worked for them. But its true purpose was revolutionary. It was a snapshot of the entire kingdom's wealth, frozen in time just after the Norman conquest. William I needed to know exactly what he now possessed, down to the last pig and acre, to tax it effectively and root out any hidden resistance. The scale of the undertaking is staggering. Commissioners were sent to every shire to hold local inquiries, essentially putting communities under oath to report their own assets. The resulting document, written in cramped Latin on 900 pages of parchment, was so thorough and authoritative that its judgments were considered final, like the biblical day of reckoning, hence its name. This was not history being written. It was data being captured, the first great administrative act of a new regime seeking to replace chaotic tradition with recorded fact. But a single survey, however monumental, was just a starting point. A living kingdom required a constant stream of updates. This is where the archive reveals a more dynamic human intelligence system. Kings depended on a web of correspondence, loyal sheriffs sending reports on local unrest, bishops informing on the mood of the clergy, and ambassadors stationed in foreign courts writing coded letters about the ambitions of rival kings. A bundle of letters from the early 13th century, for instance, might contain a sheriff's worried note about a poor harvest causing discontent in his county, placed right beside an envoy's secret dispatch detailing troop movements along the French border. These were the cables and briefings of their day. The crown sifted through this correspondence, looking for patterns and threats. A sudden spike in letters mentioning unpaid debts from a certain region could signal an economic problem about to boil over into violence. Repeated reports of a noble fortifying his castles might prompt a royal visit or a carefully worded letter of warning. The government's ability to function, to anticipate crisis or opportunity, hinged on the quality and speed of this information flow. It was a system built on personal loyalty and written trust, vulnerable to exaggeration, rumor, and the slow pace of a horse-borne messenger. Yet these fragments of correspondence show us a government trying to think ahead, to move from simply reacting to events to strategically managing them. They are the nervous system of the realm, each letter a synapse firing, carrying whispers of trouble or assurance from the outermost edges of power back to the calculating center. Yet all these writs, rolls, and letters were written by human hands. The true engine of the medieval state was not the king alone, but the small army of clerks who transformed his will into ink on parchment. These were the bureaucrats, the permanent officials whose quiet labor built the administrative memory we now study. They worked in scriptoriums within the palace or traveled with the king's household, their careers dedicated to the meticulous craft of record-keeping. To enter their world is to understand that the power of the written word was a highly specialized skill, one that required years of training. A young man, often from a clerical or merchant family, would learn his trade not in a university of philosophy, but in a practical apprenticeship. He mastered a distinct administrative language, a blend of abbreviated Latin and later Norman French that was the technical jargon of power. This was not the Latin of Cicero or the Church. It was a functional, formulaic script designed for speed and clarity in documents that had legal force. A clerk's value lay in his ability to draft a legally sound writ, to compile a flawless financial roll, or to take accurate minutes of a court proceeding, all under the pressure of a kingdom's daily business. We can personify this system by looking at its highest-ranking officers. The Chancellor, for example, was not just a political advisor. He was the head of the writing office, the keeper of the Great Seal that authenticated every royal command. His department, the Chancery, was a factory of documentation, producing thousands of writs each year. Then there was the keeper of the wardrobe, who managed the king's private treasury and household expenses, a position of immense financial trust. These men were often educated in law or theology, but their genius was administrative. They created the protocols that allowed the government to function consistently, even when the king was distracted by war or illness. Their career paths show a professional bureaucracy in its infancy. A talented scribe could rise from copying standard writs to drafting original correspondence, and perhaps one day to overseeing an entire department, gaining lands and a title for his service. This created a class of powerful administrators whose loyalty was to the crown as an institution, not just to the individual monarch. The most intimate glimpses into their work, however, come not from the finished documents, but from the marks they left behind. In the margins of draft letters, you find their personal annotations, the fingerprints of real-time decision-making. A clerk might note a query from a superior in the margin. Is this correct according to the last roll? Or verify this with the sheriff's report. You see corrections where a name was misspelled and neatly struck through, or a sum of money was recalculated. On financial rolls, careful tick marks and marginal notations show a system of internal audit, one official checking the work of another. These are the moments when the archive stops being a formal record and becomes a workspace. That smudge of ink, that hurried note in the margin, is the sound of a government thinking aloud, double-checking its facts and correcting its course. It reveals a system that, for all its personal dependence on the king, was developing its own professional standards and internal checks. The state was learning to run itself, guided by the quiet, diligent hands of men whose names we often forget, but whose pen strokes shaped the course of history. The king's most powerful seal was useless if his commands could not travel faster than a horse. Those mountains of administrative parchment we have been exploring did not sit still in a vault. They were the lifeblood of a government that was almost always on the move. To understand the reality of medieval rule, you must follow the king's own footsteps, traced for us in the itineraries and travel expense accounts of the royal household. These records reveal a ruler who was less a stationary monarch and more a perpetual traveler, a center of power that shifted from castle to castle, town to town, sometimes covering over 1,000 miles in a single year. This was not a grand tour for pleasure. It was a deliberate strategy of governance, a logistical ballet with profound political meaning. A king sitting in one capital could easily become a distant rumor to his subjects. But a king who appeared in person with his entire court, his judges, and his treasury in tow was an undeniable fact. His arrival was a spectacle of authority. It allowed him to personally hear legal cases that had festered for years, to receive the homage of local lords on their own land, and to display the splendor and might of the crown to the populace. It was also a practical necessity. The royal household, often numbering in the hundreds, was too large to be sustained by one location for long. By moving, the court consumed the resources of different regions in turn, eating through stored food and purchasing local goods, which spread the economic burden of supporting the government. The itinerary was, in essence, a circuit of consumption and control. The household roles make this mobile operation astonishingly clear. An entry might note the purchase of fodder for 200 horses in York one week, and then, a month later, record payments for repairs to the royal barge on the Thames. You can map the king's progress through these mundane details. The purchase of a large quantity of local wine hints at a feast held to impress regional barons. A payment to a town's carpenters for building temporary seating suggests a public ceremony or court session was held in the town square. This constant movement was the primary way the king managed his realm, by putting his own eyes on problems and his own presence in potentially restless areas. But this created the era's defining administrative challenge. How do you govern a kingdom from the saddle? How do you ensure that a command issued from a hunting lodge in the north is obeyed in a port city in the south, when the only copy is a piece of parchment carried by a lone rider? The solution was a blend of human endurance and ingenious security. The Curia system was the medieval internet. Networks of trusted messengers, often riding in relays, connected the traveling court to sheriffs, bishops, and garrison commanders across the land. Their speed was the speed of the state. A royal messenger carrying urgent news might change horses at designated posting stations, pushing to cover 30 or 40 miles in a day. The content they carried was always authenticated by that most vital tool, the royal seal. The seal transformed a simple piece of parchment into the direct voice of the king. It was a matrix of metal, usually kept by the chancellor or another high officer traveling with the court, that was pressed into warm wax appended to a document. Its intricate design, unique and nearly impossible to forge, was the king's signature. Every writ, every financial order, every letter of appointment bore this mark of authority. The logistics of sealing were a core function of the traveling chancery. The clerks carried the seal matrices with them in heavy, locked boxes. The wax, often a mix of beeswax and resin for durability, was a standard supply item. The act of sealing a document was a ceremonial moment of statecraft, even in a makeshift tent-on campaign, but the system had glaring vulnerabilities. A messenger could be ambushed, his pouch stolen. Bad weather could delay him for days or weeks. A local official receiving a sealed command might doubt its authenticity if the king was rumored to be somewhere else entirely. The archives are filled with follow-up letters sent months later, demanding to know why an earlier order was not obeyed, the frustration palpable in the clerk's phrasing. This fragile chain of trust and stamina meant that royal power was not a constant, uniform force across the map. It pulsed and faded with the seasons and the roads. A region the king had just visited hummed with the immediacy of his authority, a distant frontier waiting for a messenger to complete a perilous journey, existed in a kind of informational twilight where local rulers often had to act on their own initiative. The itinerary and the courier's route, therefore, were not just travel plans. They were the arteries and capillaries of the realm, and the speed of the royal will was only as fast as the horse that carried it. A sealed letter could prevent a war or bankrupt a kingdom. Beyond the domestic grind of tax rolls and court cases, the palace archives hold a different kind of paper trail, one that charts the invisible currents of international power. This is the realm of diplomacy, where the fate of nations was often decided not on the battlefield, but in the quiet backrooms of negotiation, captured in drafts, ciphered letters, and the meticulous accounts of hosting foreign guests. To read these documents is to pull back the curtain on the raw, unvarnished business of statecraft. Take the high-stakes game of royal marriage. A treaty draft for such a union was far more than a romantic agreement. It was a binding corporate merger of two dynasties, and its clauses were fought over with the intensity of a trade deal. Early drafts covered in cross-outs and marginal notes show the hard bargaining. One side might demand a staggering cash dowry, written in the margin and then circled by a clerk for emphasis. The other might insist on a clause guaranteeing military support if attacked, a promise that could drag a kingdom into a future war. The final, clean version on pristine parchment hides this tense haggling, but the working drafts expose the real price of peace and the deep anxieties behind every smiling royal portrait. These negotiations were underpinned by relentless intelligence gathering. Kings maintained networks of informants and ambassadors who sent coded reports. A surviving letter might appear to discuss the price of Flemish wool, but to a clerk trained in cipher, it revealed the mobilization of ships in a rival's harbor. This secret chatter, filed away in archive boxes, shows a government constantly trying to peer over its neighbor's fence, assessing threats and opportunities long before they became public knowledge. The most visceral diplomatic documents, however, concern the fate of captured nobles. Ransom agreements were less about chivalry and more about cold, precise finance. The archives preserve the itemized lists that set a price on a man's freedom. One record might detail the ransom for a French knight captured at a famous battle, breaking down the total into installments, so much to be paid in gold coin upon release, the rest in annual payments of wine or wool. The agreement would be guaranteed by hostages, often the man's own sons, who would live in the captor's court as surety. These documents are brutally practical, treating a noble not as a hero, but as a high-value asset to be liquidated. They reveal the intimate connection between diplomacy and the royal treasury, where a single prisoner could solve a kingdom's budget shortfall. Finally, the reality of diplomacy played out in the king's own hall. Hosting a foreign embassy was a monumental and expensive operation, recorded in those same household accounts that tracked candle wax and horse feed. An entry might note the extraordinary purchase of exotic spices, swans for a feast, and yards of expensive silk to dress the king's messengers in matching livery, all to impress a visiting delegation. The account is a script for power, showing the calculated theater of wealth and generosity designed to overawe a guest. Other entries are more revealing. Payments to translators and guides hint at the language barriers and mutual suspicion. A record of guards posted to attend the ambassador's lodgings discreetly acknowledges they were also there to watch and listen. Every glass of wine served, every gift exchanged, was a move in a silent game. These archived expenses stripped diplomacy of its grand rhetoric, reducing it to the cost of spices, the wages of spies, and the security detail for a guest who was also a strategic opponent. Together, this correspondence shows that foreign policy was a continuous, gritty negotiation over money, territory, and survival. The polished final treaty is just the headline. The real story, with all its doubts, deceptions, and desperate calculations, is written in the marginal notes, the coded warnings, and the receipts for a feast that was really a battle fought with silver plates and careful smiles. The quiet hum of diplomacy and justice all depended on a single, physical foundation, the silver penny. In a world without paper money or digital transfers, the economy was quite literally in the king's hands, or more precisely, in the furnaces of his mints. To govern the realm, you had to govern the coin, and the palace archives preserved the frantic, technical struggle to do just that. This was economic policy written in fire and metal. The most dramatic evidence comes from the records of a recoinage, a moment of profound economic reset. Imagine the king's order going out, declaring that every silver penny in the kingdom, from the merchant's strongbox to the peasant's savings, must be brought in and melted down. New coins with a fresh royal portrait and updated design would be issued in return for a fee. The administrative scale of this operation was staggering. It required temporary mints to be set up across the country, each staffed with moneyers sworn to the crown. The archives hold their accounts, detailing the weight of old silver received, the amount of new coin struck, and the seigniorage, the royal profit, taken from each batch. These documents reveal a government trying to perform a kind of primitive monetary surgery. A recoinage could be used to address a crisis, like a currency degraded by decades of clipping and wear, restoring faith in the system. But it was also a blunt instrument of fiscal power. By calling in all the old coin, the crown could invalidate the wealth of political enemies, introduce a new tax through the exchange fee, and reassert its sovereign image on the very medium of daily life. It was a reminder that the value in your pocket was not inherent but granted by the king's authority, an authority he could revoke and remake with a single proclamation. The integrity of that new coin was a matter of scientific precision, policed by another set of records, the assay reports. These are the lab notes of the medieval state. Royal officials would regularly test coins from the mints, not by counting them but by destroying them. They would take a random sample, melt them in a crucible, and measure the purity of the resulting silver. The results were meticulously recorded, often noting the exact proportion of fine metal to alloy. A poor assay meant the moneyers had cheated, diluting the silver to pocket the difference. The punishment was severe, recorded in the judicial rolls, with fines, imprisonment, or worse for those who debased the king's currency. This constant, destructive testing shows a government grappling with a fundamental challenge: how to maintain a uniform, trusted standard of value across a decentralized network of production. It was an early attempt at quality control on a national scale, where trust had to be verified through repeated, tangible acts of verification. And where there is official coin, there is always counterfeit. The court rolls are filled with prosecutions for this ultimate crime against the crown's authority. The cases are fascinatingly detailed. You might read about a silversmith secretly operating a mint in his cellar, casting crude copies of the royal penny. Or a merchant caught passing coins that were clever forgeries made of a silver-coated base metal. The language of the charges is telling, often describing the act not just as fraud, but as treason, a direct assault on the king's person and the stability of the realm. Each prosecution was a public drama meant to deter others, reinforcing the idea that the right to create money was the exclusive privilege of the state. These three threads, the recoinage orders, the assay reports, and the court cases, weave together a clear picture. They show a medieval government fully aware that controlling the coin was controlling the kingdom's economic heartbeat. It was a fragile, hands-on process vulnerable to technical failure, human greed, and the simple physics of precious metals. Every time a king ordered a recoinage, he was betting his credibility. Every assay was a test of his administration's competence. Every counterfeiting case was a fight to maintain a monopoly on trust. The Mint archives, in their blend of chemistry, law, and logistics, prove that long before central banks or economic theories, the most powerful lever of government was the right to say what counted as money. Yet for all their detail, these archives present a world seen through a single, powerful lens. They capture the government's intent, the orders sent out, the taxes assessed, the cases brought to court. But they are far less reliable at showing us what happened next. The silence between the lines is where the true friction of power resided. A royal writ commanding a baron to appear at court is a fact. Whether that baron, secure in his distant castle surrounded by loyal knights, actually bothered to mount his horse and obey is an entirely different question. The archive records the king's voice, but it cannot always record the echo or the lack of one. These documents were tools of administration, not objective journalism. They were created to serve the crown's memory, to track its claims and its income. This means they systematically overlook vast areas of life where royal authority simply did not reach or where it was openly defied. In regions dominated by a particularly mighty lord, the flow of royal writs might slow to a trickle, not because there was no business to conduct, but because local power had effectively supplanted it. The baron held his own courts, collected his own taxes, and settled disputes with his own sword. His defiance might only appear in the central records as a curious absence, a blank space in the plea rolls where cases from his lands should be, or as a single, frustrated entry years later, noting a massive outstanding debt for contempt. The archive shows us the map of royal ambition, but local reality often redrew the borders. Even more profound are the silences born from oral culture. For the vast majority of medieval people, law and tradition were spoken, not written. A village dispute over grazing rights would be settled by the memory of the elders, recalling what had been done since time out of mind. A merchant's agreement might be sealed with a handshake and a shared cup of wine, witnessed by the entire market square. These transactions, the true fabric of daily life and local order, left no parchment trail for historians to follow. They existed in the air, in ritual, and in communal memory, vanishing when those voices fell silent. The written archive, by its very nature, privileges the perspective of the literate, centralized state over the lived experience of the illiterate majority. It tells us what the king wanted to happen and what his clerks thought was important to record. It is a magnificent spotlight, but it leaves the edges of the stage in deep shadow. Recognizing this bias is not a flaw in the historical record. It is the key to reading it wisely. The gaps and omissions are themselves evidence. They teach us that authority was always a negotiation, a constant push and pull between the crown's grand designs and the stubborn, messy realities of local power, community custom, and human forgetfulness. The archive's greatest lesson may be that no government, no matter how meticulous its paperwork, ever fully controlled the story. The king's writs and tax rolls tell only one side of the medieval story. Across the Alps, a different kind of power was perfecting its own art of administration, one that claimed authority over souls as well as lands. The papal Curia, the governing body of the Pope, operated a bureaucracy whose sophistication and reach often surpassed that of any secular kingdom. While kings managed realms, the Pope sought to guide all of Christendom, and the paper trail of this ambition is preserved in the Vatican's own monumental archives, the papal registers. These massive volumes, begun in earnest in the 13th century, are the counterpart to the royal Chancery rolls. They contain copies of every important letter, decree, and legal judgment issued by the Pope, a meticulous record of spiritual command flowing from Rome to every corner of Europe. To examine them is to see a shared bureaucratic technology refined for a divine mission. The papal chancery operated with a clockwork precision that would impress any royal minister. Letters were drafted, reviewed, sealed with the leaden bulla or papal seal, and then copied by scribes into the register before being dispatched. This system of duplication was crucial for a government whose authority was constantly being tested and appealed in distant lands. A bishop in England or a monastery in Hungary could receive a papal command, and the Central Archive in Rome held the verified copy to settle any dispute over its wording or authenticity. It was a cloud storage system on parchment, ensuring the consistency of doctrine and law across a fragmented continent. The scope of this administration was breathtakingly global for its time. A single register might contain a letter settling a property dispute for a convent in Spain, a decree granting an indulgence to a crusader in Prussia, a stern rebuke to a wayward prince in Sicily, and instructions for a theological inquiry in Paris. The Curia managed this vast correspondence through a specialized bureaucracy of its own, with officials like the vice-chancellor and a host of scribes and notaries who were often trained in canon law. This points to a key similarity with royal governments. Both were increasingly reliant on a class of educated, professional administrators whose loyalty was to the office and the institution, not just to the individual ruler. Yet the tools and goals of this paperwork were distinct. While a king's writ might command a sheriff to collect taxes, a papal letter or bull often dealt in a different currency, spiritual authority, and canon law. It could excommunicate a rebellious monarch, placing his soul in peril and inviting his subjects to disobey. It could dispense a man from a vow, legitimize a child for inheritance, or annul a marriage. These were powers no king could claim, and they gave the papal bureaucracy a unique lever over the highest and lowest in society. The financial machinery was also parallel yet different. Just as kings had their exchequers, the papacy developed a sophisticated fiscal system to fund its operations, collecting payments like Peter's pence from kingdoms and fees for legal services rendered by its courts. The records of the Apostolic Chamber, the papal treasury, show an institution funding everything from diplomatic embassies to the construction of St. Peter's Basilica, blending spiritual mission with very earthly logistics. Comparing these two systems, the royal and the papal, reveals a medieval world where the technology of power, the quill, the seal, the register, and the clerk, was remarkably consistent. Both governments understood that to rule distant territories, you had to write things down. You had to create a permanent memory that outlasted the messenger. They both battled similar problems: unreliable communications, local resistance, and the constant need for revenue. But they deployed their paperwork toward ultimately different ends, one seeking order and taxes for an earthly kingdom, the other seeking obedience and unity for a universal church. Their archives, lying in separate vaults in London and Rome, are in fact chapters of the same story, the story of how writing began to tame the chaos of the medieval world, one meticulously recorded command at a time. But the very efficiency of this system had a sharp edge. For all its role in providing justice and order, the archive was also a formidable instrument of control. In a world without democratic checks, the meticulous record-keeping we have been exploring could be turned toward surveillance, punishment, and financial extraction with chilling precision. The same clerks who tracked bridge repairs could, with a slight shift in focus, compile lists of those who owed the crown not just taxes, but their loyalty. Consider the financial records. Beyond routine tax rolls, we find more targeted documents. In 13th century England, for instance, the Crown maintained detailed records of debts owed by Jewish moneylenders. When royal policy turned against these communities, these financial lists were not just account books. They became tools for confiscation, allowing the Crown to systematically seize assets and transfer wealth from a vulnerable group into the royal treasury. The parchment, neutral in its columns of numbers, became a ledger of loss for an entire community, its bureaucratic clarity masking a profound injustice. The legal system, too, could be weaponized. The plea rolls are filled with cases of collective punishment. If a village was suspected of harboring outlaws or resisting a royal forester, the entire community could be fined. The archive records these fines not as dramatic events, but as simple entries, a line item noting a payment for the king's mercy or a trespass. What the dry Latin phrase conceals is the hardship imposed on every family in that village, a financial burden levied to compel obedience and demonstrate the cost of resistance. This was the power of the state made personal and inescapable, its reach documented in ink for future reference. Perhaps most telling are the mechanisms of political surveillance. Kings were perpetually wary of conspiracy among their own nobles. The archives preserve the quiet machinery of this watchfulness. Warrants for the seizure of a suspect's correspondence, orders to local officials to discreetly report on a baron's gatherings, and lists of individuals required to post bonds for their good behavior, all appear in the administrative record. These documents show a government using its information network not to gather intelligence on foreign enemies, but to monitor its own subjects, transforming the trusted sheriff or bailiff into an agent of internal security. The efficiency of the medieval state, therefore, was a double-edged sword. The same systems that brought standardized justice and managed famine relief could, with a different intent, identify, track, and financially cripple those deemed a threat. This was not an aberration. It was a fundamental feature of pre-democratic power. The archive gave the state a memory, and that memory could be used to reward or to ruin. It reminds us that bureaucracy in itself is not inherently good or evil. It is a tool, and its moral weight depends entirely on the hands that wield it and the purposes they serve. The silent shelves of parchment hold not only the story of how a kingdom was built, but also the quiet evidence of the burdens its people had to bear. The journey of these documents from royal desks to our computer screens is a story of neglect, disaster, and dedicated rescue. For centuries after their creation, the vast administrative archives were simply stored, often in damp castle cellars or forgotten palace towers, where they were seen not as history but as outdated paperwork. They were vulnerable to every threat imaginable. Fire was a constant danger in buildings heated by open flame and lit by candle. Damp and mold slowly consumed parchment, turning inked letters into ghostly smudges. Perhaps the most significant loss came from deliberate destruction during periods of profound political change. In 16th century England, the dissolution of the monasteries ordered by King Henry VIII led to the dispersal and often the burning of countless monastic libraries and their archives, a catastrophic loss of local records that had supplemented royal ones. Centuries later, the upheavals of the French Revolution saw revolutionary committees targeting the symbols of the old regime, which included the parchments of royal administration. In many cases, these documents were not burned out of malice toward history, but because they represented the legal and financial claims of a hated system. They were fuel for bonfires of authority. Yet in a strange twist, the physical durability of parchment often saved it. For generations, these old rolls and sheets were seen as scrap material. Bookbinders would cut them up, using the sturdy, blank backs of legal documents to form the hard covers and spine linings for new books. Lawyers might reuse them for drafting notes. This casual recycling meant that fragments of a 13th century tax assessment could end up holding together a 17th century Bible, preserving them by accident long after their original purpose was forgotten. The fate of the archives changed dramatically in the 19th century, an era of growing national consciousness and historical curiosity. Societies like the Rolls series in Britain began the monumental, painstaking task of locating, editing, and publishing these records. Teams of scholars, often working by candlelight in dusty record offices, would meticulously transcribe the difficult medieval Latin, compare different copies, and produce printed editions with scholarly notes. This was not glamorous work. It required a patience as immense as the rolls themselves, deciphering faded ink and archaic abbreviations to make the voices of clerks and kings accessible to a new world. Their labor transformed these administrative tools into historical sources, building the foundation upon which all modern understanding of the medieval state rests. Because of their dedication, a researcher today can pull a digital scan of a pipe roll from the year 1200 onto their screen, reading the same figures a royal auditor checked under a checkered cloth. The archive's survival is a fragile thread, connecting us directly to the operational heartbeat of a world long gone. Those silent gaps in the parchment are not dead ends for historians. They are puzzles waiting to be solved. Interpreting these archives is less about passive reading and more about active detective work, a methodology that pieces together a fuller picture from fragments, contradictions, and telling omissions. The true skill lies in learning to read the gaps. A single document tells only one side of a story, but by cross-referencing multiple record types, historians can triangulate the truth. A royal proclamation announcing a new tax, full of confident language about royal right and necessity, is one piece of evidence, but its real impact is measured elsewhere. By turning to the local court rolls from that same period, a researcher might find a sudden surge in cases of debt or property seizure, suggesting the tax was brutally enforced and caused widespread hardship. The pipe rolls will show whether the expected revenue actually appeared in the royal coffers, or if the totals fell short, hinting at resistance or economic strain. Even the physical condition of the document speaks volumes. A series of tax rolls from a particular region that are suddenly filled with hasty, sloppy handwriting and unusual abbreviations might indicate the clerks were under immense pressure, perhaps because of famine or unrest, rushing to document a collapsing system. This layered approach transforms dry entries into a multidimensional narrative. Scholars also employ quantitative analysis, using modern tools to find patterns invisible to a clerk counting pennies one by one. By digitizing the data from hundreds of pipe rolls, historians can track economic trends across decades. They can calculate the changing value of a knight's fee, map the rise and fall of wool exports through customs accounts, or identify which regions consistently paid their taxes late, suggesting a pattern of localized defiance or poverty. This number crunching reveals the long-term rhythms of the medieval economy, the slow currents beneath the surface of dramatic events like wars or coronations. But perhaps the most subtle skill is learning to decode the formal, formulaic language of bureaucracy to uncover human motivation. The standard phrasing of a legal writ was designed to be impersonal, but the deviations from that formula are where personality and pressure leak through. A charter granting land might use all the correct titles and blessings, but a historian will note the unusually long list of witnesses, which could mean the grant was controversial and needed extra validation. A letter from a king to a pope might be couched in respectful piety, but a close reading of the word choice and the sequencing of requests can reveal a barely concealed threat or a desperate plea for help. This forensic attention to language can resolve historical mysteries. One classic example involves the sudden death of King William II of England, William Rufus, in a hunting accident in the New Forest in the year 1100. The chronicles of the time offer conflicting accounts, some hinting at murder, others calling it a tragic mishap. The palace archives, however, hold a different kind of clue. By examining the royal writs issued in the days and weeks immediately after the king's death, historians can trace the frantic movement of the new king, Henry I. The geographic pattern of these documents, showing Henry racing to key cities and treasury sites to secure oaths of loyalty and control the royal seal, reveals a prepared and decisive takeover. The administrative paper trail suggests not a period of shocked mourning, but one of swift, premeditated action. The silence of the records on any investigation into the death a notable omission given it was the killing of a king, speaks as loudly as any accusation. The archive, in this case, does not provide a smoking gun, but it maps the behavior of the beneficiary with a clarity that the narrative chronicles, often written years later with their own biases, cannot match. This is the historian's craft, using the bureaucracy's own tools to peer behind its curtain, listening to what the documents say, what they omit, and what they quietly assume. The brittle parchment in a vault is only half of the archive's story. The other half exists as light on a screen, a transformation that has democratized the medieval past in ways its original clerks could never have conceived. Across the globe, a monumental effort is underway to digitize these fragile records, photographing every membrane, scroll, and fragment in high resolution. Projects like England's Anglo-Saxon Charters or the Vatican Secret Archives Digitization Initiative are creating vast online repositories, turning what was once the exclusive domain of specialists in a reading room into a public library accessible to anyone with an internet connection. This is not merely about preservation, it is about radical access. A historian in Tokyo can now examine the same 12th century charter as a student in Toronto, all without booking a flight or handling a document that crumbles at the touch. The physical archive protected the memory of the state. The digital archive liberates it. This liberation unlocks a new kind of historical vision. For generations, researchers had to painstakingly read through rolls line by line, their understanding limited by the sheer physical endurance required to search centuries of handwriting. Now, with optical character recognition software trained to read medieval scripts, these digitized collections become searchable databases. You can type a name, a place, or a term like bridge repair or wool tax and instantly find every mention across 100 years of records. This changes the very questions we can ask. Instead of studying a single king's reign in isolation, scholars can perform big data analysis on the medieval state. They can map the geographic spread of royal justice by tracking where writs were sent over decades, visualizing the crown's reach as a pulsating network growing stronger in some regions and fading in others. They can analyze economic trends by compiling data from thousands of pipe roll entries, charting the rise and fall of commodity prices or the shifting burden of taxation after a war or a poor harvest. They can reconstruct social networks by following the names of witnesses on charters, revealing the hidden circles of influence that connected powerful families across the kingdom. This digital lens allows us to see patterns that were invisible to the clerks who created the records. A human reading one membrane might note a fine for trespassing in a royal forest. A computer analyzing 10,000 membranes can detect that such fines spiked in a certain county whenever a particular sheriff was in office, suggesting a pattern of aggressive enforcement or even personal corruption. It can trace the career of a minor official through fleeting mentions in different documents, building a biography from administrative fragments. We are no longer just reading the documents, we are listening to the hum of the entire system, hearing the rhythms and anomalies of governance on a continental scale. The digital archive does not replace the need for careful, nuanced interpretation, the detective work of reading between the lines. Instead, it gives that detective a panoramic map and a powerful magnifying glass at the same time. It lets us step back to see the forest of medieval administration in all its complexity, while still allowing us to zoom in to examine the unique grain of a single telling tree. The revolution is not in the parchment, but in our newfound ability to see the whole world written upon it. The digital revolution reveals a profound continuity, for the core architecture of our modern state was built not in the age of steam, but in the age of parchment. The medieval systems we have explored are not relics, but the direct ancestors of the governments that shape our lives today. Consider the annual budget, the very foundation of modern fiscal policy. Its lineage runs straight back to the pipe roll. That 12th century document, with its meticulous accounting of revenue and expense for the kingdom, established the principle of annual financial review and centralized record-keeping. Today, when a finance minister presents a budget, they are participating in a ritual of accountability perfected 800 years ago in the Exchequer Hall, simply swapping a checkered cloth for a digital spreadsheet. The legal authority of the modern state still rests on the power of the authenticated document. Every passport, every court order, every property deed derives its force from the same principle as the royal writ sealed with the Great Seal. That small strip of parchment, bearing the unique mark of sovereign authority, was the original secured document. Our digital signatures and official letterheads are the technological grandchildren of that lead bulla pressed into wax, all serving the same purpose: to command trust and action at a distance. Even the concept of a centralized national archive, where the official memory of the state is preserved, is a medieval invention. The rolls stored in the Tower of London or the Vatican were the first attempts to create a permanent, organized repository of governmental action, ensuring consistency and precedent. Today's national archives and digital record-keeping systems are the direct evolution of that idea, the recognition that a state cannot govern effectively without a reliable memory of its own past decisions. Most enduring of all is the professional civil service. The clerks of the Chancery, the auditors of the Exchequer, and the keepers of the wardrobe were the prototype of the modern bureaucrat. They were career administrators, loyal to the office and the system rather than solely to the individual ruler, operating on standardized procedures and written rules. Their expertise in law, finance, and logistics created the first professional class of state management. The modern civil servant, bound by regulation and dedicated to impartial administration, stands in a direct line of descent from those ink-stained clerks drafting writs by candlelight. This is the hidden legacy of the palace archives. The bureaucratic state, often seen as a modern or even industrial creation, has roots that reach deep into the medieval world. It was forged not in philosophical debates about democracy, but in the daily, gritty necessity of collecting taxes, dispensing justice, and feeding an army on the move. The next time you file a tax return, receive an official letter, or hear a government report, you are interacting with a system whose basic grammar was written centuries ago on sheepskin. The medieval clerks, in their relentless effort to bring order to a fragmented world, built the administrative skeleton upon which our modern world still stands. The romantic image of armored knights and crowned monarchs tells only a fraction of the story. The palace archives reveal a more fundamental truth: that medieval power was a complex, paper-driven, and deeply human enterprise. This was not a world governed solely by the sword, but increasingly by the quill, the seal, and the ledger. The true machinery of the state was this gritty administrative network of clerks, couriers, and accountants, all working to translate royal will into actionable reality across a fragmented landscape. They built a system of governance from parchment and procedure, creating a memory for the kingdom that outlasted any single king's reign. This bureaucratic foundation, with all its flaws and ingenious adaptations, is what slowly tamed the chaos of the medieval world, transforming personal lordship into something resembling a state. Understanding these origins is crucial, for it shows us that the governments we know today did not spring fully formed from modern revolutions. They evolved over centuries, their roots embedded in the very administrative practices we can now read online, in the frantic marginal notes of a clerk and the meticulous sums of a tax collector. This long development from household management to institutional bureaucracy is the silent backbone of history. So the next time you encounter a grand historical narrative of kings and battles, look for the hidden machinery behind it. Seek out the digitized court rolls or the published financial accounts, the primary sources that let you hear the scratch of the pen that built an empire. There, in the unedited record of daily crisis and control, you will find the authentic pulse of the past, a reminder that power has always required not just charisma and force, but filing cabinets, reliable messengers, and an endless supply of ink.